Hello everyone, it's Tony here from Locks to Reads. Day 5 of, and there goes a book, of Remembrance Reads. I had a bit of a slack reading day today, it has to be said. I didn't read any of A Farewell to Arms. I might read some later tonight, but I haven't done any reading of it in time for this video. I did read part 5 of Parenthesis, which is mostly about them coming in and coming out of the front line, and illustrates that classic military phrase that war is 90% boredom, 10% terror. The one thing in Parenthesis does quite a lot is it drops in popular songs, and men sing songs, and it uses popular songs for sort of within the text. So that's all quite interesting, and I always forget that. It's an odd chapter, this one, because things are happening and things aren't happening. The frustration that must be the constant marching backwards and forwards, and in the rain. It's the tedium. He actually does a very good job of illustrating the tedium in an interesting way, if that isn't a contradiction in terms. There's scenes in estimates, cafes. There's talk of sick parades, battalion orders. There's a little discussion about Father Martin Larkin, who is the Catholic padre. There's lots of discussion of the weather. There's a whole section on they are preparing for an offensive, so there's a whole section about the sort of weapons that get brought up. Key fingered out the long roster of weapons to be borne, and the last particular for specialist details, for chosen fire eaters, for the co-opted runners, for the flank bombers with their respective loads, and for the born leaders, the top boys, the heroes' gravescod, the elect, the wooden crossed dicks. It's interesting, actually. When I read that, I thought top boys doesn't sound like something from the First World War. I've only ever heard it used to describe the head men in football hooligans in the 1980s. So to see it there, this has happened a few times. There's a few times where he's used a word that I think of anyway, as like a 20th, like a late 20th century, early 20th, like fancied for I fancied her, he fancied her. It's odd that sometimes it pops up like that, and you think, oh, maybe those words are long. There was one earlier which I can't remember, but it was quite fascinating. And then so by the end of it, they are sort of parked up. They are waiting. There's lots of rumours going around. There's lots of discussions about what's going to happen. Some of the rumours are ridiculous, like they discuss the possibility they're going to the Middle East. But there's an offensive coming, and they know it's coming, and those discussions are part of, I suppose, the sort of nervous reactions to these things. And there's again descriptions of like officers making speeches. It's basically it's almost like the holding chapter of this book. It's still packed full of great writing, still packed full of weird incidents and odd words. But I every time I read this, there's more in it, and I understand more. He has a lot of footnotes, but I think you should think of the footnotes as a part of the poem, not as a sort of separate. I think T.S. Eliot has foot. Is it T.S. Eliot that has footnotes? Somebody has another poet at the time. Actually, one thing I have noticed recently in this is the influence of Eliot on David Jones, which I've never really considered before. Probably because I'm stupid. But there is, and it's much more modernist in its writing style than I remembered. I think because a lot of the references are to medieval, to Celtic, to old Britain. I think there's I sort of let an assumption crawl into my head that it was quite. It was written in some sort of classical, old-fashioned style, but it's not. It's a very modernist take. This, so it's fascinating in that respect. I also then picked up. Now I forgot I had this. The problem with my bookshelves, I mean, you could see some of them there. The problem with my bookshelves is they're not in a particularly organised order. Sometimes generally the multiple books by the same author are put together, but a lot of and apart from that, stuff is scattered all over the place. So I forget sometimes where I've put things. But I found this, which is Heroes Twilight by Bernard Bergonzi, which was originally published in 1965, and it sort of does what Paul Fussell does. And actually, I think it would be a good one to read as a sort. It'd be a good one to read as a sort of balance to Fussell. So I wasn't planning to read any of this, but there is a whole section on in parenthesis and David Jones in here, which I read today. It's only a short. It's called Remythologising, and it's only 11 pages, and it ends. I'm going to read the last sentence because it's always nice to find a proper academic critic who agrees with your opinion on something. In parenthesis has attracted criticism as well as admiration, but I believe it is the greatest work in English to have come out of the First World War, and still slightly neglected masterpiece of modernist literature. So Bernard and I agree on that. Although I would probably have not mentioned the modernist thing because I'm not that clever. But this covers a lot. I mean, it does poets, and so it does. It has. Chapter 1 is Between Hotspur and Falstaff, reflections on the literature of war. Then 2 is Preludes. Then 3 is Poets 1, Brooke, Grenfell, Sawley. 4 is Poets 2, Graves, Blunden, Reed and others. 5 is Poets 3, Thomas and Gurney. 6 is Sassoon. Sassoon often gets his own thing. 7 is Poets 5, Rosenberg and Owen. 8 is Civilian Responses. 9 is Retrospects 1, Autobiography. 10 is Retrospect 2, Fiction. 11 is Remythologising, David Jones in parenthesis, which is what I've just talked about. And 12 is Memory and Myths. And then there's Appendix, which is the problem of war poetry, which I'm looking forward to reading. So I'm going to read this. I'm going to put this onto the list because I think but I'm going to wait until I've read Fussell first, who I read nothing of today. It was, as I said, a slack day. I feel like at least I did something. It's very easy. The non-remembrance reads might not have ended up reading anything today. The other thing I read was a short story in the Penguin First World War short story collection called, and you have to bear with me while I look up my thing, Private Meyrick, Company Idiot, written by Sapper. Now, I suspect most of you might not be aware of Sapper. That's obviously not his real name. He was a British Army officer and he was writing short stories during the war, and it was the done thing not to write under your real name, so he used the pseudonym Sapper. After the war, he created a character called Bulldog Drummond, who is a kind of public school thug turned adventurer detective. He was massively popular in the 20s and 30s, I read a couple of the books when I was a teenager. Uh, they are surprisingly um, honest about how war brutalised Bulldog Drummond, and made a not particularly intelligent man into a punchy thug. Um, they are also a lot of British writing of the 1920s and 1930s. It has a degree of anti-Semitism that you you have to either ignore or comment on as you read it. The Bulldog Drummond books, Sapper's writing, that anti-Semitism is above and beyond the Call of Duty. He has been accused of being a fascist. I'm not sure that's entirely true, but it isn't comfortable to read. And I think I'd be surprised if anybody ever reprinted any of Bulldog Drummond's stuff. Of Sapper stuff in the modern world without editing it significantly. But the short story is actually quite good and quite surprisingly sentimental. It's a little bit funny in a sort of but dark, humorous way, but it's a fun, it's a surprisingly sensitive take on what the army does with a not particularly bright, daydreaming person. I was surprised how much I enjoyed it actually, even though the ending is it is quite dark. He does talk a lot in the story about the importance of discipline, and I think there is but we'll talk about that. But there's a quote from the start which I thought was surprisingly sensitive, which is the condition of a man's brain after he has sat in a trench and suffered an intensive bombardment for 2 or 3 hours can only be described by one word, and that is numb. The actual physical concussion, apart altogether from the mental terror caused by the bursting of a succession of long-range shells in a man's vicinity, temporarily robs him of the use of his thinking facilities. He becomes half-stunned, dazed, his limbs twitch convulsively and involuntarily, he mutters foolishly, he becomes incoherent. Starting with fright, he passes through that stage, passes beyond it into a condition bordering on a coma, and when a man is in that condition, he's not responsible for his actions. His brain has ceased to work, which I thought was quite a strong paragraph for a Sapper short story. So that's all I've read. That's the only things I've read today. There's no reason why you have days when you're in the mood and you have days when you're not. But I am on course to finish in parenthesis in the 7 sections in 7 days. Then I'll do a little video on in parenthesis in general. I haven't started reading the Thomas Dilworth book, the biography of David Jones, and also that somebody pointed out a book to. I found another book on David Jones that I would really like to read. That was published in 1983 and is out of print and seems to be very expensive in second-hand form. I will make a note of that one in my notes. But yeah, that's it for my reading today. I'm sorry it wasn't more in terms of volume, and I'm looking at what to. And so hopefully tomorrow I'll read. I might even try and read 2 chapters of Paul Fussell tomorrow. Hemingway will get done. It's a fairly straightforward, simple read. Everything else that I'm reading requires a bit more thought, note taking, etc. Which is damning Hemingway with faint praise, but I'm sure he can cope. And being dead, I don't assume he doesn't care. So that's it. So I will speak to you all tomorrow. Have a good day. Bye bye.